So my name's Jennifer Hendry from the University of Leeds, and today this podcast is about giving a presentation. So just a quick task to start off. Have a think about the best and the worst presentations that you've seen. You'll certainly have seen some, whether or not they've been academic ones. Have a think about those, whichever topic and whatever context, and consider particularly why you thought they were good or why you thought they were bad. So the chances are that some of these reasons are listed here. The better presentations will be interesting, informative, focused. The worst will often be overloaded with detail, unstructured, and the killer often far, far too long. What we have to remember is that presenting is a skill. It takes practice, and it often has to be approached in quite a different manner to that of written work. So this short podcast will focus on some of the things worth considering, these things listed here. Whenever you're preparing a presentation of your own research, it'll also highlight some potential pitfalls and some potential stumbling blocks. So let's start first of all with content. Most conference presentations will be fairly short. They'll be usually between 10 and 15 minutes long. So you'll have to select points or arguments from your research. You'll have to choose exactly what it is you want to get across to this audience. What do you want this audience to take away from the presentation? What is of most relevance to this particular audience? Importantly, what feedback is it that you're after? Give your aims some advanced consideration. Consider what it is that you want to get out of this presentation and also what you want to convey from the presentation. Once you know what you want to convey, then make sure that this is clear to the audience. We use the term signposting for this. Signposting is flagging up what it is you're going to be talking about. It's really useful for making your conclusions seem considered. Also, remember that a presentation isn't a mystery story. It isn't a spoiler to flag up in advance what your goals are. So once you've established what the main points are, something then to consider is the timing. Everyone has sat through one of those awful presentations where it meanders in the beginning and then speeds up and speeds up and speeds up, and at the end it's a complete car crash. And you always feel sorry for the person giving this presentation because you know that they'll have prepped it, and it's oftentimes because they have a lot to cover. And one of the fiddliest things when you're starting to prepare presentations is knowing just how much information, just how much detail, just how much content is needed to fill the time allowed. And this will vary from person to person. Different people speak at different speeds and have more content on slides, for example. It's best, really, instead of using a rule of thumb, one that could be one slide per minute, really just to give it a practice run through. Running out of time is frustrating because you either have to rush through what you want to say or you have to finish early and you don't get to say it at all. In this sense, practicing in advance is important, and this is really a more general time management consideration. You're the one in charge of your schedule as a doctoral student. Maybe not completely, but your diary and what you commit to is something that you have to own. So consider before you say yes to a conference presentation or before you apply to do it, that you in fact actually have the time to prepare the presentation for that conference, for that workshop. This is something that you can always ask your supervisor about. It's not a situation that you have to decide all about on your own, but sometimes it's better to be like, maybe this isn't the one that I should be attending right now, instead of spending what will often be quite a limited conference budget and then having to show up a little unprepared. Specifically, conferences have topics, and oftentimes panels will have topics. And in this sense, we would like always to tailor a presentation to your audience. Depending on the type of workshop or conference you're speaking at, the audience will vary. So it's worth giving some thought to who is in that audience. Is it an audience of academics? Is it an interdisciplinary audience? Are there members of the public there? Will the audience understand the specific terminology that you're using? Is it the goal in this panel or workshop to discuss perhaps method instead of content? Speak to the audience that you have. A lot of the tailoring of a presentation is helpful in terms of keeping it relevant to the set topic or theme, and that keeps it interesting to who you're speaking to. In terms of interest, when you present, most of the time you'll start with a slide or a note to the title. And in terms of that title, audiences are going to want to know what you're on about pretty early on in the presentation. So it's worth considering this when you are structuring it. So this is, to a certain extent, connected to the signposting point I mentioned earlier on. Avoid the temptation to replicate the structure of a written paper. You're going to be condensing a written paper or written chapter or a draft piece of work into core points and main argument anyway. And really the structure of your presentation should reflect those core points and main arguments. It may be best for these circumstances to start with an example, to start with a case study. It might make sense to open with a real-world problem. Whichever of these that you actually select, try to convey your key message. So doing this is going to require you to focus on those core issues, those core cases, those ratios, those pieces of data, those theoretical insights that are necessary to establish that key message, and then to be able to conclude strongly. So it's important for you, before you start your presentation, to know what the big things are, the big things that you want to get across to the audience. So that's the content and the structure. So what about the style? The best presentations won't only be informative, but will also often be quite entertaining. What place is there then for throwing in some humour? This is arguably a judgment call. Some speakers will just be more comfortable with being funny. Some people will just be more comfortable with throwing in the odd joke here and there. But a presentation doesn't have to be funny to be engaging. It doesn't have to be funny to be interesting. So remember that at the beginning, when you're learning the skill of presenting, it doesn't have to be humorous. Don't shoehorn in the funny at the expense of your content. Remember, you can improve this skill through preparation and practice. And sometimes you just get much more comfortable the more you practice doing anything. So one of the main reasons for giving a presentation is to get feedback on your work. And most of the time this feedback will come in the form of questions, usually at the end of a panel session, although occasionally you'll get it directly after your own presentation. You should really expect to have questions. And in the sense that you should be prepared to get questions, you should also, to a certain extent, be prepared to answer them. This is, again, something you can prepare for. Now, of course, you can't expect to preempt every possible question that you're going to get, but it is worth perhaps giving some thought to potential questions that might arise. Why that method? Why that theory? Why that case study? Don't panic in the event that you don't have an answer, though. Some doctoral candidates I've worked with in the past, I'm worried that they'll be asked questions that they don't have an answer to. People, when they're doing academic work, not everybody has an answer to every question. That would be pretty unrealistic. Don't panic in the event that you don't have an answer. Sometimes a question will simply be on something you haven't considered, and that's okay. In a large-scale project like a PhD, you won't have considered everything right at the beginning. You oftentimes won't have considered anything right at the end. The main thing is not to panic. Don't be scared to say, you know, that's something I actually haven't considered. Perhaps we can talk about it later. The main thing, as I say, is not to panic. And that's generally the best advice about speaking in public. It's okay to be nervous. Everyone gets a little bit nervous when speaking in front of an audience. especially when that audience is full of experts, and especially when it's a large one, especially when it's students staring at you, expecting some form of entertainment. But speaking in public is an everyday reality in academia. There's nothing wrong with being nervous, but those nerves have to be managed. Whether it's teaching a class, whether it's speaking to the media, whether it's conveying information to the public, or whether it's discussing research with other scholars, public speaking is a necessary skill in academia. It's something that we just have to get used to doing. Preparation and practice, yet again, can both help with composure. In terms then for practice, here's a quick checklist. It can be worth having a go through your presentation in advance. For example, does it fit within the time frame? That's usually the big one. The other one, is the order appropriate? Is the order of this material logical? A common one, can I pronounce everything? Some of the case names perhaps can be awkward, some of the theory can be difficult to say. Do you know when to change slides? Do you have to go and find the clicker? Do you have any bad habits? I'm currently dancing around from foot to foot. I tend to play with my hair. Do you have any bad habits when you're presenting? Do you touch your face? Do you bite your nails? All of this can be a little distracting. It's not a problem to have these tics, but it's useful to know what they are before you start giving your presentation. And in terms of giving the presentation, sometimes these technological aids can be helpful. I mentioned changing slides there. You won't always have slides, but in the occasion that you do, it is worth prepping them in advance, obviously, but also having a look at what other technology you'll be using when giving your presentation. Do you have the necessary adapters? Do you have the plugs? Have you got the clicker, as I mentioned before? If you're using slides or other visual audience aids, this can help with presentation structure, it can help with timing, but do beware the pitfalls of conference technology, and if possible, always give it a check in advance. For online presentations, which will become obviously more and more common, it's useful to have a check of your audio and your visual feeds. It's frustrating to record something in advance or think it's recording when it is in fact not. It's frustrating to spend a significant portion of a panel going, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? And I'm sure we've all lived through some of those quite recently. So check the tech in advance when you have the opportunity. Slides are pretty common. It's not something that everybody is comfortable using, but to the extent that it's a reasonably standard thing, here's an example of a PowerPoint title slide. Of course, I'm using PowerPoint title slides as they go on, but these are the old Leeds versions. The blue ones are the new ones, much improved, as I'm sure you'll agree. Most of these will be available on your institution's website. You'll be able to download these and use them for your own presentation. And in terms of slides, they're handy for reiterating information that you want to remind your audience about. For example, your name and your contact details. To that extent, here are mine. I hope you find this short presentation to be useful.